So let's talk about putting an effective force of power armor on the tabletop, with an overview of writing a strong Space Marine army list in Warhammer 40k. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought I'd do a bit of a combined video for Space Marines and talk through a fair few things that you might want to think about when putting together an army of them. This building is definitely a big topic with so many different ways to play the faction, and particularly more so now there's so many choices of detachments that Space Marines can field. So in this video I thought I'd try and bring quite a lot together and talk through some of the units and choices that you might be most likely to take in a Space Marine list. For this one I'm not going to stress the basics of 40k list building too much. If you've not written an army list before in 40k, then I'll leave a link to my how to write an army list video down in the video description. But basically in 10th edition, army list creation is pretty simple and straightforward with Games Workshop's handy flowchart. For actual practical list building and adding up units, points values and things, I'd recommend either Battlescribe or maybe the 40k app. That way it can be quite easy to see what you have available and add and remove units really quite quickly. And when it actually gets to adding units and things, the basics of any other army list apply. Choose your faction, and for Space Marines also choose any chapter keyword you might be going for. Then you need at least one character, 0 to 3 for most units, 0 to 6 battle line or dedicated transport units, and you can't have more than one of each named epic hero. Getting into Space Marine things though, there's a fair few things that you might need to decide. I thought we'd start off with the list basics, so things that can either deal damage, be primary objective takers, take secondary objectives, and any other interesting support units that you might want to add to your army list. After those, let's just talk through the various things that chapters can add to armies, basically giving you a whole load of options for other secondary units and other detachment options, and then go through each detachment in Codex Space Marines and what ways that might push your army list to go in one way or another, as particularly in 10th edition detachments tend to be really quite unit focused, certain units and keywords doing a lot better in one of them than another. Starting out though, let's jump through sections of a Space Marine army, and perhaps start out with the biggest and most exciting in your army's primary damage dealers, basically the units that are out there that are really quite efficient in terms of what sort of enemy units they can kill. Destroy your enemy's units and remove them from the battlefield, and shut down what options they have to damage your army or take objectives. Damage dealers in army lists generally can either be tough or tanky, or they can just be very hard hitting and expect to die in return when the enemy hits them back. Provided they can take a good chunk of the enemy army down when they go, then it's all well and good. I'd say just as a very rough rule of thumb, I'd expect around about 50% of an army list to often revolve around things that just tend to be very efficient in damage or defense. Though some lists might go all in or just near enough all in to just completely overpower their opponent and hope that the objectives will sort themselves out, or potentially keep them to a minimum and play a very cagey guerrilla warfare type game. Depending on the army, both can be effective. For damage dealers in 40k in general, I'd usually argue that both a mix of range and melee tends to help a bit. For Space Marines at the moment, I'd say that probably a slightly skew towards range might generally help out armies better, though it does depend on detachment and chapter. But if, say, you were playing a full ranged army, it would usually make sense to have at least some melee countercharge threats, as that can be a massive big deal to be able to countercharge enemies that get over aggressive and just rush towards you. Or alternatively, if you are playing almost nothing but melee Space Marines, maybe loads of Space Wolves on Thunder Wolves or similar, it's almost certainly going to make sense to have at least some ranged fire support to reach out and touch and damage things that otherwise your combat troops wouldn't be able to catch until very late in the game, and by then they might have got loads of turns worth of damage dealing done. Strong efficient damage dealers will definitely vary depending on points changes and updates from Games Workshop, though at the moment I'd argue things like Aggressors and Land Raiders, Eradicators, maybe Blade Guard supported with characters, could be good units that could fit the bill. Quite a lot of raw damage for Space Marines often tends to come in gun tanks and dreadnoughts, things like the Gladiator Lancer, Redemptor or Ballistas dreadnoughts, perhaps the Vindicator or Repulsor Executioner. Plenty more options of course of greater or lesser strength, and it's not like more support units can't chip into the damage dealing either. Choice of these I guess would also be very dependent on detachments as well. Say for example in the Space Marine Ironstorm Spearhead you're going to want your main damage dealers to be mostly tanks and vehicles, as they get loads of support from the stratagems and the enhancements. Otherwise, besides just looking for things that are raw good in terms of destroying the enemy, you might want to be thinking about units that can take primary objectives, and I think it's usually worth having a plan both for how you're going to take the objectives in the midfield, and at least on tournament maps and things, thinking about taking usually the one singular objective in your home deployment zone. Things in the midfield ideally need to be at least fairly tough for the cost, as they're often going to have to stand in the open and weather the enemy's damage output, so things with either a lot of wounds or toughness, or high and vulnerable saves and things tend to be good choices for this, and of course any other rules like high objective control can certainly help with that. On the other hand, for units trying to take your home field objective, there's a few different ways that you could go with that. You could go for something just super cheap and aim to have them hide from enemy fire. You're often able to hide things on home objectives behind terrain. Or you could plan to put long-range damage dealers on the objectives, maybe things like ballistas, dreadnoughts, or predator tanks or something that can just tow onto the objective while still providing good fire support. Or maybe even have indirect fire support things sat on your home objective like a whirlwind, both scoring the objective and still contributing pretty maximally. I feel like out of these, infiltrators are certainly worth a mention. They're at least somewhat tanky with their feel no pain type save, but their main rule is the 12-inch deep strike denial. They can be really nice to park on a home field objective for that reason, so it means that your opponent can't just deep strike units and attempts to charge the thing on your home field and steal the objective away at least for a turn. If that's not a concern though, you could potentially push them up and put them in the midfield. Again, they'll have that good deep strike denial rule and just be quite handy as they can forward deploy and get bodies on points right from the word go. Otherwise, scouts are a lot cheaper if you want some threat in the midfields to just put things on objectives. They are genuinely quite tough for the points, but not really too hard to remove on a per unit basis. Ideally, they want to be hidden on objectives if they possibly could be, and then be an interesting trading unit to force your opponents to perhaps charge and destroy them, and then open their unit up for a big counter attack. Otherwise, just for sheer tanky stuff, 3 wound infantry with high and vulnerable saves doesn't go too badly on midfield objectives. Perhaps Terminators or Blade Guard could be an option if you're using them. Big things with an enormous amount of mass and still quite a lot of models could be good for objective control, plus just not getting wiped out even if your opponent does focus fire. Intercessors might be worth a shout. They have high objective controls, can skirmish okay with enemy infantry, and get the sticky objectives type rule. That could be handy and give you a few more issues with trying to take points off you. And even things like aggressive vehicles moving forward to deal damage might be able to stand on points for a turn if they're not contested. Things like Redemptor Dreadnoughts maybe, or Land Raiders that were just transporting something. They don't have as much objective control, but they could chip in. Then besides primary objective takers, there's secondary objective support. I'd say for the majority of Marine armies, most of the time it's usually best to have the option of going for the tactical secondaries at least, and usually that's going to be a lot easier if you have certain units that you can turn up at different areas of the table or move quite fast to get to points and things. Basically, cheap units with infiltrators, deep strike, or fast movement will usually help out quite a bit with that. Out of these, Space Marines do kind of famously have the Inceptors at the moment. Their ability to drop just anywhere just out of 3 inches has so many options for getting advantages in game. They've got okay damage output, so can certainly bully lighter enemy infantry units, and the plasma ones can take a chunk out of elites. But for small units with a 3-inch drop, that can basically near guarantee that you get certain secondary objectives, say deploying teleport homers or behind enemy lines. Space Marine Scouts again, as well as being good for the primary objectives, are just helpful to have very cheap units up the board early on. That could put them in a good position to do plenty of secondary objectives already. Same with Eliminators, who can forward deploy and then essentially double move with an Instigator Bolt Carbine. And plenty of lists quite like to include a Calidus Assassin as well, the assassin that can jump on and off the board. Perhaps turn up in the corners of the board for things like investigating signals, or various other late game secondaries. Scouts can be quite good for that as well, as they also have a return to reserves type rule. Overall for these, I'd say you probably don't usually want to go overboard, though some lists do quite like to play a bit guerrilla warfare with all sorts of minimal squads hiding and jumping around the board. Usually army lists might take around about 10 to 20% of their points on these style units, though you definitely could take more. And perhaps Inceptors in particular do seem to be a unit that tend to get taken en masse in some army lists, just because they're kind of godly for secondary objective type units, but their damage output is really quite solid as well, and having loads of threats just turn up at one section of the enemy army might well be able to overwhelm it. Otherwise, beyond those primary battlefield roles, there's all sorts of things that just make your other units work a bit better, or just handy to have on the board. Space Marines have access to a really quite big cast of characters, and any sort of synergy units could really amp up your primary damage dealers, whether it's things as simple as a chaplain for a +1 to wound, or a lieutenant for lethal hits on a Blade Guard squad perhaps. Space Marines also have a fair few units that create sort of focal firepower support, so incursors that can mark one target for a +1 to hit, the Stormspeeder Thunderstrike that can give you a +1 to wound against vehicle units, or the quite often taken lieutenant with a combi weapon. The lone operative one with his reactive moves and things, he can mark one objective for some extra damage, as well as just going around doing lone operative style secondary things. All of these I wouldn't really go too heavy on, and I'd probably be tempted just to take one in a list if I did, and it perhaps kind of depends on just how many heavy guns you're using in the army. If you've got an entire army that's a gun line full of big punchy vehicles that could use these buffs well, then you could justify going kind of heavy. If you're going very mixed with range and melee, then you might just not have as much returns as taking another dangerous firepower unit. Otherwise, on the nice to have pile of things, indirect fire is really quite good as well. The Space Marine Whirlwind often makes an appearance in plenty of army lists. The Strength 8 and AP2 profile is really quite nice and fairly resistant to the barrage penalties, and having at least a bit of indirect in a list can be handy just for removing, say, the last couple of units on an objective marker, or putting some pinpoint damage on an enemy unit that's very fragile but very dangerous, where maybe if you can just kill 1 or 2 models out of the unit, you're likely going to be saving some of yours. I feel like a single Whirlwind is rarely a bad thing to include in a list, and I have seen several top lists take multiples. Finally, for support and maybe slightly synergy type things, army command style buffs can be handy enough. Captains can be good value to have one of in an army list to get you some free stratagems, and if you did have any chapter specific things that allowed command point regeneration, then they often tend to be pretty interesting picks in their own right, say Azrael for the Dark Angels or Marnius Calgar for the Ultramarines. It does kind of depend on their overall offering for the points, but I'd say that those two are well worth the price right now. Finally, for support units, I thought that Deep Strikers and Reserve units might deserve a special mention as well. Again, I feel like there's something that have good value if you include at least some of them in an army list, but probably go diminishing returns if you go too heavy on them, maybe barring Scepters. For other more regular Deep Strike units, I'd be tempted to have at least some but not loads in a typical army list. That way you force your opponents to bother to do screening and try and make sure that they can't drop anything within 9 inches of their forces. And if they don't, or their army list is too elite and not able to, it means that you could take any easy wins to try and pick up undefended, expensive enemy units, or even potentially threaten long-range charges on enemy home field objectives and things, which could be kind of game-changing if you can take that away from them for a turn. They're also pretty handy for doing secondaries, as we mentioned before, and I feel like having the opportunity to use rapid ingress with these can be pretty game-changing as well. It's really quite a powerful stratagem to allow you to set up a unit with perfect knowledge and then basically near guarantee a charge on the enemy in the right circumstances, provided you've got somewhere to bring them down safe. 4 good Space Marine units for this, we already mentioned Inceptors, which are rather godly at the moment. Terminators I think are quite nice for a rapid ingress threat type unit. The Jump Assault Intercessors I think are really quite a nice mix of very cheap units at just 85 points with OK defense and OK damage. Really quite nice to skirmish with enemy infantry units, or even things like Eradicators in strategic reserves could make your opponent think twice about where they put their heavy vehicles. Putting that all together, here's just one very rough generic idea for how a bunch of those general ideas might come together in a well-balanced Space Marine army. This one's maybe a little bit firepower heavy, and maybe a touch light on the objective control, but at least has really quite a lot of fearsome damage dealers, some synergy firepower units, and plenty of things to do secondary objectives. Leading up the list and one of the big punches down the middle, we have an Apothecary Biologist with 6 Aggressors and a Land Raider Redeemer. That should put some pretty fearsome threat on the midfield objectives, plus have some awesome Overwatch potential as well. Then there's 2 units of Eradicators, one that might go in strategic reserve and the other one that might hide out in the Repulsor Executioner to jump out and deliver some melter death if anything gets too close. 2 units of Inceptors to drop close, one with the bolter weapons, one with the plasma loadout, good for doing secondaries and having the right sort of damage output to hit certain targets. For some Phobos goodness, there's some Incursors to light up one target for a +1 to hit, and some Infiltrators that might well guard the home field objective unless the opponent really didn't have any deep strike or reserve type things, and a unit of Scouts that likely will start on a midfield objective and try and just cling to life for the first few turns and try and make themselves scarce. Then there's the other main damage dealers of the list, a bit of mixed heavy support firepower with a Ballistus Dreadnought, a Gladiator Lancer, and a Repulsor Executioner with the Laser Destroyer. Between those 3 they should be able to have some threats to take down enemy heavy hitters. A Stormspeeder Thunderstrike that could give you a +1 to wound against vehicles or monsters if needed, and also a Whirlwind Lurky in the back to put just a little bit of pinpoint firepower where you most need it. Overall, between all that, there's enough damage dealers to hopefully beat down most of the enemy's big threats, some slightly annoying skirmishing infantry to claim a few objectives, and a bit of secondary support with the Inceptors that could either drop for damage or drop to score you points in the enemy's deployment zone and things. Maybe not the most awful start for a fairly generic Space Marine list overall, and I've not used any detachment or chapter specific stuff for this one, so obviously if you chose a chapter or a specific detachment, that might push you to take a few certain units depending on your choice of those. Talking of which though, let's move on to talk chapters, which depending on the way that you collect your Space Marines might already be kind of set in stone if you're dedicated to one force and aren't going to be changing out. Lots of people like to stick true to their heraldry through thick and thin. Plenty of people do go for their own chapters and own successor colour schemes though, which might be a bit more flexible. Although the rules gained and lost between them are maybe a little bit more minimal than they were before, it's pretty much just the choice of extra characters and bonus units that your army might get access to. A bunch of special characters from the core Codex chapters, and then expanded to a whole load of extra units as well for the more divergent ones. The more divergent chapters also get their own unique detachment as well, which none of the other chapters can steal, so that can be another source of strength, but only really if it's actually going to be stronger than whatever else you already had access to. Overall, from a pure list building point of view, your chapter choice will generally be best if you've got strong selections and quite a lot of them. As say if you only have one special character, then he's only got so much impact that he can have on a game, even if he is maybe a bit better for his points compared with other things that you could field. Looking first at the core Codex chapters, the ones that are less divergent, I'd argue that the two that are perhaps most competitively interesting at the moment are probably the Ultramarines and the Salamanders. They only get extra characters, but at least they have multiple strong ones. For Ultramarines, I'd generally be quite tempted by the overall offering for Armanius Calgar and his Honor Guards. Advance and charge, CP generation, and just general melee might are rather hard to go wrong with. Uriel Ventress could be pretty interesting, teleporting units into battle that otherwise couldn't get there. Could be fun for Eradicators or Devastator Centurions, and giving something Deep Strike pairs quite well with the Vanguard Spearhead, where you can put things back up into the sky. And Tigurius I feel like is a very powerful character, though maybe just a bit undone by the choice of squads that he can lead. Quite a powerful damage dealer with his psychic attacks and the buffs that he gives his units. Gilliman I'd say is okay, but maybe just a little bit on the costly side for what he brings at the moment, though he can certainly hold his own in melee, and free stratagems can be quite powerful for certain detachments, maybe in particular for Ironstorm Spearhead, weirdly enough. Getting extra battle tactics on big scary vehicles is nice. Salamanders on the other hand just have the two characters to offer, but both of them are good. Ajax Agatone is nice and cheap, and makes Blade Guard very dangerous with the full wound rerolls. And Vulcan Hestan is rather interesting for putting debuffs on one unit to allow rerolls with Melters or Flamers. Really nice with Infernus Marines or Land Raider Redeemer, and does particularly well in the Firestorm force with the devastating wounds on Torrent Weapons stratagem. I think between those two they do add quite a lot of strength to an army, so maybe one of the top picks for the Codex chapters. Otherwise, for the core Codex, I'd probably rate pretty much all the rest of the characters as alright, but not enormously standout. Most of these, besides the Imperial Fist, only have the one extra character to add to proceedings, which can be hard to sell as an overall reason to run the chapter, compared with things that can get you extra characters and extra units like the Divergent ones, or at least on a purely optimizing point of view. Corsaro Khan would likely make most sense in Blade Guard. Ironfather Pharos might be nice in heavy intercessors for the feel no pain, while also boosting a nearby vehicle. Imperial Fist Lysander I think is interesting enough for -1/2 wound Terminators, it makes them very tanky indeed. Pedro's an okay generalist for Imperial Fist, and for the Raven Guard Kavan Shrike I would probably use with a big unit of jump intercessors for a big annoying lone operative style unit, not being able to be shot at range and packing some punch in melee. Otherwise, for what the other Divergent chapters offer, Blood Angels perhaps particularly stand out with Death Company with Lamatis. Librarian Dreadnoughts are really quite nice in Gladius to allow you to teleport units around the board. Could be nice to throw some Eradicators around or get the aggressive Fire Discipline combo where it needs to be. Dante and Sanguinary Priests are both quite nice. They're a lot better now they've actually been updated with the units that they can lead. And Bar Predators are okay Overwatch. In general, their Sons of Sanguinius detachment isn't really considered all that strong. When they do tend to have good tournament success, it tends to be with other things like Gladius or even Ironstorm. And just in general, they're a chapter that's considered somewhat lower strength currently. For the Dark Angels, I'd rank them as a bit more medium strength. Probably their biggest picks are Azrael for command point generation and just being a pretty good buffing character with almost no matter what he's with. Could be fun with Hellblasters or even just company heroes or intercessors on the cheap. Deathwing Knights are a big interesting unit as well, an enormous threat Terminator unit, as is the Terminator Command Squad. They could be quite fun to infiltrate up the board in Vanguard Spearhead potentially. That'd be a lot of Terminators on your doorstep straight away. Similarly to the Blood Angels, I wouldn't really consider the Unforgiven Task Force a particularly great asset. It just doesn't seem to add quite as much as some other things. Some nice stratagems, but the core rule is a bit on the weak side. For out-and-out competitive Space Marines, the Black Templars do seem to be in the lead as the strongest Space Marine chapter right now. Both their sets of Crusader squads are great. Primaris Crusaders put loads of power arm on the board for very cheap, Lots of melee threats and are quite nice with either Grimaldus or the Tannhauser's Bones enhancement, both of which give you a fairly meaty 5+ feel no pain. Firstborn Crusaders seem to be pretty much undercosted as well, just 65 points for 5 Space Marines that can pack a las cannon and special weapons is kind of outstanding. Very easy to use, and particularly so in Ironstorm Spearhead where you get some free rerolls thrown in. Helbrecht and Sword Brethren are both fine as well, big melee combat there, and Sword Brethren can be made to go up to some fairly ludicrous damage output, and their boosted tanks are rather strong as well, basically paying minimal costs for extra multi-melters on top. Their Righteous Crusaders detachment it also rates as one of the stronger ones, giving you some extra durability and melee tricks, plus that Tannhauser's Bones enhancement is nice. For Deathwatch, I'd consider them a bit more of a weaker Divergent chapter currently compared with some, though they have had some success with the Blackspear Task Force in the past. I feel like that detachment is alright, though definitely got a lot weaker now the special issue ammunition stratagems are locked to bolters, mainly makes them just good for a few key units like Aggressors or Inceptors perhaps. The Tome of Ectoclades does seem to be set at its full reroll wound rolls thing, so that's rather good, and Beacon Angelus is quite nice to get units in nice and close with rapid ingress. Otherwise, for their actual units, perhaps the strongest datasheets might be their Proteus Kill Team and Deathwatch Veterans. They can pack some interesting combos with heavy firepower at range, and fairly massive melee with the heavy Thunderhammers as well. Plus the Deathwatch Terminators I'd consider an asset, with 5-man squads packing 3 different heavy weapons, and could be a lot of Cyclone missiles. Overall, a fair bit of their other stuff, maybe it is a little bit on the costly side. I feel like they do have some very interesting units that could be used for big stratagems and enhancements. Anything that's a big asset to any one infantry unit could be really nice on them, maybe things like forward deploying in Vanguard Spearhead, or you could use the Gladius Fire Discipline combo on a Proteus Kill Team if you wanted to. Finally, for chapter choice, we have the Space Wolves. I might rank them second overall in terms of power, mainly due to their Thunderwolf cavalry and particularly excelling with the Stormlance task force. Thunderwolves and their characters to support them are just kind of all-round strong for their 30-point cost, nice and tough and fairly generalist damage and get damage too on the charge, and they do have a lot of character options to support them and make them hit even harder against heavier things. Otherwise, a fair few other strong datasheets. Logan Grimnar producing an across-the-board melee boost is rather nice. Bjorn and Murderfang are both very threatening dreadnoughts. If I were running Space Wolves, I'd absolutely be taking a fair few Fenrisian Wolves for just fast-moving, cheap units to screen and do secondary objectives with. They seem to be borderline auto-include to me. And Wolfen can add a fair bit of threat, even if they won't be doing most objective things. They are really quite cheap, both for their damage and defense at the moment. Their unique detachment is the Champions of Russ, and again, unfortunately, that is usually considered one of the weaker ones right now. The Sagas are just a little bit fiddly to manage to make go active, and at least a little bit dependent on your opponent most of the time. Overall, I'd say that any Space Marine list can be strong enough just by playing into more of the detachment benefits rather than chapters, but the chapters do usually add a few interesting bits. I've seen plenty of army lists that almost run everything as just standard core Space Marines, and then maybe just take 1 or 2 utility units from one of the chapters just to add a bit of a spin on a standard Space Marine army. Perhaps a fairly common one is having a single Librarian Dreadnought in a Gladius task force to allow you to teleport shooting things around the board. In general though, most of them do have some fairly good selling points at least, though perhaps the core Codex chapters that only have one special character, or not particularly exciting ones, may be a little bit less so than most. Finally, that brings us on to detachment choice, so I thought I'd just go through each of the ones from the core Codex rapid fire, as the Divergent chapter ones maybe aren't as relevant to as many people. The choice of detachment definitely influences what sort of units you might want to run, given the stratagems and enhancements and things, so I thought we'd just go through each of them and talk about how it might influence the Space Marine units that you build an army list with at the top of the video. I'll also just show either one example of one of these army lists that did well from previous videos on the channel, or a rough one that a theory crafted, just for an example of a few things that might come together for an army. In any case though, for the detachments from the core Codex at the moment, I'd probably consider the Gladius Task Force and the Ironstorm Spearhead as some of the strongest. They're the ones that tend to get played the most and tend to be most relevant to a lot of people's collections. Ironstorm gives you a lot of raw strength, and Gladius is just very relevant to lots of armies on the board. Otherwise, perhaps the other two that see at least some success are the Vanguard Spearhead and the Firestorm Assault Force, and in general rarely played competitively are the Anvil Siege Force, the Stormlance Task Force, and the First Company Task Force, though admittedly the Stormlance does very well with Space Wolves, it just needs to have an army with good mounted units, which currently the core Codex doesn't really. Starting out, we've got the Gladius task force, generally considered quite strong, and the rules are general purpose to suit a lot of people's collections. The core rule is, of course, their combat doctrines, multiple turns of either advance and shoot, advance and charge, or fall back, shoot and charge. Between the lot of them, maybe slightly rewarding things that tend to be a bit slower or shorter ranged, maybe things like aggressors, eradicators, or blade guard veterans perhaps, maybe having a little bit more value here than elsewhere. Gladius tends to be pretty helpful to just about any Space Marine army, so if I were running it, I'd want to run the Fire Discipline combo in some way. Basically that's taking that enhancement for 30 points, putting it on either a Primaris Lieutenant or an Apothecary Biologist, and then you can activate Devastator Doctrine, maybe with Storm of Fire as well, use it on the Oath of Moment target, and you basically reroll loads of dice to try and get 5 pluses, which are both lethal and sustained hits. I have made videos on that combo before, so feel free to check out my Gladius Task Force video if you want to see a bit more on that. The most common loadout for that would be 6 Bolt Storm Aggressors with the Apothecary Biologist, and maybe getting them in range with a Land Raider perhaps. Though you can do all sorts of variants, maybe run the same thing with Hellblasters or even a Deathwatch Proteus kill team, or maybe use that Librarian Dreadnought from the Blood Angels to teleport them round the board, or Uriel Ventress's Deep Strike rule. Otherwise though, I'd say the other enhancements are so-so, perfectly usable but not quite as game-changing. Here's just one example of a Gladius task force list from a month or so back. This one was a fun one with Calgar and all the lieutenants. Calgar's heading up a big squad of Blade Guard alongside a lieutenant there. Very, very scary to have all of those power swords coming at you with lethal hits as well. The Fire Discipline combo is in effect here as well. It's on 10 Hellblasters with a lieutenant with the Fire Discipline trait. There's a whole load of really quite great objective support units between Inceptors and a bunch of Phobos and Scouts, and then some heavy lifting from Gladiator Lancers, a Whirlwind and a Brutalis Dreadnought. Next up there's Ironstorm Spearhead. Again, as mentioned, this is considered one of the strongest ones, and basically you want to be including really quite a lot of vehicles in this one, as all of the stratagems give you good support for them. Options for things like Auto Explode, Ignoring Modifiers, and a few other bits, though perhaps the single best one is Mercier's Weakness, sustained hits on a 5 and a 6 if you're a vehicle unit targeting an enemy unit that's injured. If I were playing this one, I'd absolutely go heavy on the vehicles and the direct damage dealers, Redemptor and Ballistus Dreadnoughts, maybe Gladiator tanks or Repulsor Executioners. Vindicators are good as well. And I'd certainly be including a couple of Tech Marines with some of the better Warlord traits. There's one that can allow you to cancel failed saves on units nearby. That one is very, very, very good. And there's also the big one with the Aura of Lethal Hits as well. That one's amazing. And again, that can allow you to do a Fire Discipline light combo when you combine it with the Mercier's Weakness stratagem. That's one that I'd attempt to be using each turn with one Tech Marine with the Lethal Hits trait, buffing a vehicle to get sustained hits on a 5+, that also get to be lethal hits on a 5+. For chapter combos, Black Templars tend to be great with this as well, given that they have bolt-on multi-melters on all their Gladiators, Repulsors and Impulsors, making some already fairly threatening tanks even more so. Here's one example of a Black Templars Ironstorm Spearhead run by TJ Spaeth, who used it to get first at a 57-player tournament. Loads and loads of firepower with this one, a Ballistus and then 4 Gladiators, 2 Lancers, 2 Reapers, an Invictor, a Redemptor, a Stormspeeder Thunderstrike, Tech Marines with the lethal hits and Adept of the Omnissiah, and then actually quite a lot of objective control with a whole bunch of Crusader squads with las cannons, plus a Scout squad and some Assassins for objective support. The las cannons will certainly like the individual hit rerolls the detachment brings as well. Next up, we've got the Vanguard Spearhead, again considered one of the stronger ones. The core buff is quite general purpose and helps out most things that are going to keep their distance, giving you stealth and the benefit of cover. That's really quite good for vehicles as well as infantry. Ranged dreadnoughts like the Ballistas might be particularly hard to take out with stealth and cover even when they're in the open. Otherwise, the majority of the stratagem and support helps encourage ranged infantry more than anything else. It's probably worth taking a bit more ranged shooting infantry than you might have been going to otherwise. Things like Eradicators, Aggressors, Devastator Centurions, and maybe Hellblasters perhaps. They've got stratagems that can help support them, and they've also got really quite a nice return to reserve stratagem to allow things to redeploy. That can be really big for things like Devastator Centurions or Eradicators, and particularly things with Deep Strike as well. I remember that World Champions list by John Lennon, who could have Uriel Ventress repeatedly Deep Strike Centurions if it made sense to always get a line of sight despite their low movement. Otherwise, the big combo that I'd build around with this one would be the option to infiltrate a unit with an enhancement. I'd absolutely try and get something big, tough and threatening into the midfield that way. Something like Aggressors, Blade Guard, or maybe even Terminators could be a good choice for that. Something that's got the potential to deal enough damage to seriously put the enemy back if you get first turn and move straight into their deployment zone with it, but also perhaps something that's tanky enough to actually take a few hits if the opponent gets first turn, are likely going to be able to damage it with at least something. There are some stratagems that help out Phobos and Scout type units, but are maybe a little bit more limited. I'd probably take some Phobos units and Scouts, as most lists tend to, really, but I feel like you're not as obligated to go overboard on them as opposed to some other themed detachments. Talking of that World Champions Art of War list by Mr. Lennon, this one's probably the single most prominent Vanguard Spearhead list that's been out there so far, an Ultramarines one with Calgar and Ventress, Calgar joining a bunch of Aggressors with the Apothecary Biologist with the Infiltrate type traits, a pretty terrifying little threat to have in the midfield that could do first turn charges potentially. Otherwise, Uriel Ventress can give the Deep Strike keyword to those Devastator Centurions, repeatedly Deep Strike them around the map. There's lots of things that could pop up for enormous damage, 2 units of 3 Eradicators and loads of Inceptors, plus some Scouts and a Calidus Assassin to help with scoring a bit more. Looks utterly terrifying, and loads of options for positioning tricks, with loads of Infiltrators and very close range Deep Strikers. Next up, we've got the Firestorm Assault Force. Generally, this does tend to be again one of the more popular ones, as it does have some really quite usable buffs for shooting. Advance and shoot, +1 strength at close range, and a +1 to wound stratagem are all very generally usable by lots of forces, though given that 3 out of the stratagems are all focused around transports, it definitely would make sense to include at least some of those in the army. I feel like the overall cluster of rules does tend to push you towards the Salamander's favoured units of things that can do some heavy close range firepower. +1 strength up close is really quite nice for melter weapons to get them to strength 10, so Eradicators will be nice with that. Inceptors quite like the +1 strength as well, seeing as they'd be dropping in close. And Advance and Shoot is pretty helpful to get just about anything ranged, either with line of sight or in range of their targets. For more efficient transport combos at the moment, I'd be tempted by Land Raiders with Aggressors or Blade Guard plus character support in them. And Repulsors are rather nice for any ranged firepower you might have, things like Eradicators, Hellblasters or Infernus Marines. The latter due to the enormous devastating wounds stratagem that you can use in this, which can be quite nice to set up with Vulcan Hestan as well. He could allow you reroll Flamer wound rolls against your target, which pairs amazingly with 10 Infernus Marines getting out to douse their foes in Prometheum. I would be quite tempted to try and make it so I had either a 10-man squad of Infernus Marines or a max squad of Flamer Aggressors to be able to threaten that stratagem. Otherwise, for their character enhancements, I quite like both Champion of Humanity ignoring modifiers and Forged in Battle to change the dice roll to a 6. Both of those really are quite excellent value for their points cost and pretty handy to have on any big lead unit. Here's one example of a Firestorm Assault Force that did okay at a tournament in the not too distant past. Going for a classic Salamanders approach with both Vulcan Hestan and Adrax Agatone, Vulcan could allow the Infernus Marines to reroll wound rolls. Adrax looks like he'll be joining some Blade Guard, and there's both squads of Eradicators and Aggressors on the field as well. I guess joined both by a Captain and an Apothecary Biologist, at least one of those big blocks riding in a Land Raider Redeemer with a character attached. Lots of scary close range shooting, plus big units in transports. Seems like it's hard to go too far wrong with that in the Firestorm Force. Moving on to the detachments that are considered a fair bit less strong, there's the Anvil Siege Force next. This one doesn't really do too much for your army unless you're managing to stay stationary with heavy weapons and things, which unfortunately is just rarely a good idea in any table with an adequate amount of terrain, as it means that you won't be gaining line of sight or making progress towards objectives. Besides things like indirect firepower like whirlwinds, you might not have that many units that really want to stay still. I still would be tempted to take a bunch of units that could profit from the detachment rule though. I'd certainly take probably multiple whirlwinds as a base, and then I feel the units that get at the actual heavy keyword on their weapons to activate the +1 to wound is rather nice. Probably some better choices for that are things like the Intercessors and Heavy Intercessors, Eliminators, Hellblasters, maybe Devastators. They all have a little bit higher value than usual, but I feel like often if they're just going to be sat in the open, they might well be taking big shots. Again, these guys have a big sustained lethal reroll combo, though it does involve a unit sitting still in the open. It still could be fairly nasty though, with perhaps a big squad of heavy intercessors. They would be spitting out a fair amount of dangerous bolt shots, and they're the sort of unit that you could actually have remaining stationary in the open, and the opponent might struggle to be wiping the entire unit. Otherwise, for enhancements, I'd probably be tempted by the 6+ Feel No Pain and the Ignore Cover ones. They seem like the best value overall. Without too many Anvil Siege forces having much success, here's just one of my takes on them. Not really anything too optimised here. There's a lieutenant with a big squad of Hellblasters to ideally make good use of that stratagem if they can get a turn of shooting off when they're static. Some heavy intercessors to hold the home field, maybe one could push up towards the midfield to fight for an objective. There's 3 sets of 3 eliminators with las fusils, where the +1 to wound could make them genuinely quite threatening. Some devastators with las cannons, a bunch of scrappy jump intercessors to fight over objectives or maybe drop to do secondaries, and then some fire support tanks in the backfield, 2 whirlwinds, a gladiator lancer, and a repulsor that could transport the hellblasters if it made sense, and a terminator captain with a terminator squad, or with the 6+ feel no pain enhancement. In reality, could probably have made way for at least a little bit more objective support, perhaps throwing in something like a single unit of scouts and a single unit of inceptors would probably help out quite a bit on that front. The Stormlance again is also considered one of the weaker ones, sadly. It does allow the entire army to advance and charge, so anything that fights in melee will have more advantage here than some other places, but almost everything else is locked to being a benefit of mounted type units, of which the core codex only really has Outriders and the character support, plus Invader ATVs, and unfortunately none of those are really very strong right now or able to carry an army damage-wise. As mentioned, it is great for the Space Wolves with their Thunder Wolves though. In general, unless you're going very heavy on the mounted things, I suspect most lists that were eyeing up this would probably be better off with Gladius for the most part. They can still threaten some advance and charge, and for 1 command point on the most important unit to each turn, but also has a bunch of other powerful tricks rather than things that just apply to the biker units that aren't going to be able to damage enough anyway. If I had to build around this one though, it probably would be multiple units of Outriders, perhaps a fair few marine melee units. The storm speeders might get a bit more of a look in as well than they would normally due to having a -1 to hit and wound stratagem on the go. In reality though, if I had to build a list around this, it'd probably be Space Wolves with 18 Thunderwolves and some character support as a starting point, and then go from there to try and round the list out with a bit of shooting and objective control. Talking of which, here is my rough idea for a Space Wolves Stormlance. Loads of Thunderwolves as mentioned, headed up by a bunch of characters, both Bjorn and Murderfang just for some strong dreadnoughts, infiltrators, scouts, jump intercessors, and 3 sets of Fenrisian wolves to work on the objectives around the map, and then a bunch of tanky vehicles, a Redemptor Dreadnought, Ballistus, Gladiator Lancer, and a Stormspeeder Thunderstrike. The Stormspeeder could use that debuff stratagem if it got targeted too early. Finally, we come to the first company task force. This is the one that is pretty much locking the benefits to Blade Guard, Vanguard, Stern Guard, and Terminators. A bit of a limited unit roster really. Out of those, I'd consider the Terminators and the Blade Guard kind of okay, but still maybe not at the absolute top of the Space Marine tree power-wise. The Stern Guard and the Vanguard veterans are considered at least fairly weak at the moment. The core rule for this grants 4 wound rerolls for Oath of Moment once per game, which really isn't all that much, but I guess it might encourage you to take a few Stern Guard with devastating wound weapons. It could give them 1 spectacular burst of fire out of those. And otherwise I feel like you need to take a kind of critical mass of those units to make it more worth it compared with other detachments, again maybe like the Gladius. Otherwise you were probably just better off with something a bit more generalist where the stratagems can be used on your other units. I certainly want at least some Terminators on the board, given that they've got one of those return to reserve special rules, so once they've teleported in and done some damage, you could put them back into the sky to come down somewhere new if it made sense. Beyond that, I'd probably expect around about half the army to be made up of veterans, and then support with just some efficient fire support and objective things as with the rest of the list. For the enhancements, the 5+ reactive Feel No Pain I think is more than worth 15 points, absolutely excellent on a Terminator squad that's just about to get focused down. And Fear Made Manifest is quite a quirky and costly enhancement, but it could be interesting on something like a Phobos Lieutenant in a unit of Reavers. It gives the opponent the chance to lose models if they fail Battle Shock, and that could genuinely be a big threat in that kind of unit. It'll depend on what sort of thing your opponent's got in their army though. Putting that together though, here's just one example of an army list that goes very heavy on the Termis. There's a massive great big squad of 10 of them with a captain and an ancient in it, and a smaller one with the Terminator Librarian with the objective control enhancement. He's leading up a smaller squad of 5 of them with assault Terminators with Thunderhammers and Storm Shields. Then there's 6 Blade Guard veterans with a chaplain footslogging it up the board. The chaplain takes the +1 attack enhancement once per game. And then backing them up, there's some fire support with 2 units of Stern Guard, maybe focusing down at the extremist threat targets, 2 units of scouts, a Land Raider to deliver the Blade Guard in combat, sorry they weren't footslogging I remember now, a Redemptor Dreadnought and a Predator Annihilator, just to add a little bit of strength and some anti-tank. Realistically the first company is a bit underpowered and maybe Games Workshop might do something to make it stronger at some stage. It does feel like if you're trying to build around it too hard, then your list probably isn't going to wind up as strong as some of the rest. In any case, hope some of that might have helped some of you a little bit. I feel like there's a lot to consider when building Space Marine army lists. Lots of things that work well in basically any list, between damage dealers, the things for taking primary and secondary objectives, and nice to haves like whirlwinds and synergy pieces. But then everything's both going to get a bit warped both by your chapter choice and also by your detachment choice as well. I feel like there's a lot of interesting combos that could be out there just due to unusual combinations of the Divergent Chapters with different options out of the Codex Detachments. I did find it quite interesting the other day to see things like Deathwatch Proteus kill teams being used in things like Vanguard or in Gladius. You're making use of the infiltration or the fire discipline enhancements. In any case, I'll leave it there for this one. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, and which units have been making it into your Space Marine list or have been seeing time on the shelf this edition. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked down in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep all these videos coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.